Hi, this is Mike Nemeth, Marketing and Communications Director for the California Apartment Association. Today I am joined by Debra Carlton, CAA's Chief Lobbyist, our Executive Vice President of State Public Affairs. We'll be talking about Senate Bill 466, which is an attack on the Costa-Hawkins Act. Let's get started. Hi, Debra. Thanks for joining us for today's CAA Vidcast. So we're here to talk about Senate Bill 466 by Senator Aisha Wahab, a new senator out of Hayward. And this is an attack on the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. Before we dig into SB 466, it may be helpful for viewers who are not really familiar with Costa-Hawkins if you could give a brief overview of what that landmark legislation does.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So to understand Costa-Hawkins, it was passed in 1995 by the California legislature and the governor signed it. And basically what that law does is tell cities what they can and cannot do if they decide to pass their own local rent control law. So what the state law tells local governments is that while you can have local rent control, it cannot be imposed against housing that's constructed after 1995 and new housing that was already exempt from a local rent control law. Like in some cities, they had already passed ordinances that had exempted anything past 1978. They can't bring in more housing after that time. Single family homes and condominiums that are separate from the title to any other dwelling units also must be exempt. And the biggest deal, and I think probably one of the most important parts of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, is that when a tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in, the rental property owner can reestablish rents up to the going rate or the market rate in their community. So that's called vacancy decontrol. And those are the general provisions of the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act.
Thank you. And now let's talk a little bit about SB 466. Why don't we start out with what it would have done as originally proposed, and then talk a little bit about how it's been morphing over the past couple of months.
Sure. So as originally introduced, the Senate bill would have allowed for local governments to impose rent control on single-family homes and condominiums. That was a pretty big deal. However, since the bill's been introduced a few months later, due to CAA's opposition, that language was pulled from the bill. So it goes back to the original law, which says that single-family homes and condos cannot fall under local rent control. Now, what she is also saying in her bill is that as originally introduced, there'll be a rolling date. So every 15 years, new housing, meaning the other types of rental housing, multifamily housing, would fall and could fall under local rent control. So it would roll, and then another year later, it would roll, and you'd have more housing under local rent control.
So that would do away with the 1995 or anything with a certificate of occupancy after February 1st, 1995 date, and replace it with this rolling period. Just playing devil's advocate for a second here, what's wrong with that concept?
Well, what's fascinating is some people look at the date of the housing and they say, well, it's probably already paid off. Or they'll say the owners held it, they've for sure made their money back. But what's not really understood is that housing has probably been sold since then. So a new owner who may have a mortgage now on the place was never anticipating that they would fall under rent control. So the laws in the game would change on them. Maybe they had planned to do work to the property. Maybe they had done quite a bit of work to the property because the housing was old. So they expended dollars, and now with this rolling date, they may not be able to recoup their dollars because of the extensive amount of work they've done.
So for people who own the housing, moving to this rolling date could be really problematic. What about for new development? We call this an anti-housing bill because it has the potential to stifle the addition of much needed rental housing in California. When If the legislature starts to tinker with that 1995 date or the other dates that you mentioned, 1978 or 79 for pre-Costa-Hawkins rent control laws, what signal does that send to home builders and or developers of rental housing?
Yeah, well, as you know, it's very expensive to build in California. In some areas, the Bay Area, it's $1,000 a square foot to build. And I get it. That's why housing and rents are escalating because it is so incredibly expensive. Not to mention, it can take 10 years before you can even break ground. So California is not an easy place in which to build. I think the better approach, obviously, is to promote more housing and affordable housing, right? And not impose rent control, which we have always argued will make a bad situation even worse when it comes to construction.
And I think there's been an assumption among developers that the 1995 date would always be there, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
if it starts to change, is there a concern that it can be viewed as a moving target? Who's to say once you start messing with that 1995 date, it can't be changed more frequently and become newer and
Absolutely.
newer housing? That's
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we end up with is housing that falls under these strict forms of local rent control. And some of those local rent control laws don't even allow you to increase rents annually equivalent to the consumer price index. A lot of them will say 60% of the consumer price index. So as you can imagine, in some cities, that's maybe $20, $30 annually. Often that won't even help you recoup the costs of your taxes on your property. It
right.
won't help you recoup any of the money to pay for the increases in trash and sewer, which we've seen grow over the years.
We have an update. Last night, Monday, May 15th, Senator Wahab amended her legislation to change the rolling date from 15 years to 28 years. This still creates a moving target and would stifle the development of rental housing in California, and CAA remains opposed to this bill. Now, over the next few minutes, Deborah will explain some of the differences between the rent caps that cities and counties can impose and the rent cap established by legislation called AB 1482 or the California Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which applies a more reasonable rent cap on housing when it turns 15 years old, so also a rolling date with that law, if the housing is not already subject to rent control at the local level.
What's very different is if a local government passes rent control and they pull in new housing after 15 years, those rents are very low. Like I said earlier, 60% of the consumer price index. Now, 1482 is a state law that was passed a couple of years ago that said housing, once it's 15 years old, would come under the state version of rent caps. And those
Mm-hmm.
rent caps are much different, right? They are 5% plus a consumer price index, not to exceed 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you can imagine, that's much different than your rents that are below the consumer price index, as some local governments have done.
What types of impacts could we see on construction of new rental housing if SB 466 becomes law?
I think we'll see a slowing of housing construction. I think you'll also see sales of older housing start to go down. It's going to be very hard to sell that older housing.
Mm-hmm.
The work that gets done to some of that older housing probably won't happen as frequently as it does today. So if you build something today, I think we're going to see a slowing of housing production, and it's not going to benefit California at all. The bill is currently on the Senate floor sitting there. What we're asking our members to do is write to their senator to let their senator know that this bill is not helpful to the industry and that California already responded with AB 1482 several years ago, and that was
Mm-hmm.
the answer, not changes to Costa-Hawkins.
Got it. Well, Deborah, thank you very much for the explanation of SB 466 and the really helpful background on Costa-Hawkins because people really need to understand the bill and that law to understand what's at stake
Sure. Thanks,
Thank,
Mike. See you
all
next
right.
time.